So, dear colleagues, welcome to this live stream discussion. It's the first of 3 discussions that CONCORD is organizing in the run-up to the European elections. And we're very happy that we're going to be welcoming quite a lot of people to join us. The numbers keep going up, I see that, but we only have 1 hour together and the time is very short. And I've been informed that Udo may need to leave a little bit early. So I want to be really sure that we don't lose the time that we have with Udo. Let me just start by introducing very briefly the event and the speakers, and then hopefully we will have everybody on board that we need for the event. So CONCORD is the European Confederation of NGOs working towards equal, just and inclusive societies in a sustainable world. And we're, of course, working very hard on the European elections as part of the EU presidency project to try to make sure that we keep the democratic space open, that people who are standing for election understand what civic space is about and are willing to defend and promote civic space. And this is why we're having this conversation today. I'm Tanya Cox. I am the director of CONCORD, and it's my great pleasure to be the moderator for this event. I'd like to welcome our 5 speakers. We have Udo Bullmann, who is an MEP within the S&D group in the European Parliament. He's the chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee and a member of the Development Committee in the European Parliament, and a long-time ally of CONCORD's working towards progressive society. We have Soraya Rodriguez Ramos, who is an MEP with Renew in the European Parliament, and she is chair of the Pan-African Parliament delegation and a member of FAM. And FAM is the Gender Equality Committee within the Parliament. And Soraya has also worked on the 2021 annual report on human rights, so also a big supporter. Welcome to Marie Lostis, who is the advocacy coordinator with Forus, and she has extensive experience in amplifying the role of civil society, shaping efficient people's policies. And previously, Marie worked for Civicus, so a wealth of knowledge to bring to this conversation. Very happy to welcome as well Carolyn Johnson. Carolyn is a policy coordinator working with European Partnership for Democracy, where she focuses on reinforcing the impact of EU democracy policy, both inside and outside of Europe. And previously, Carolyn worked for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Also very happy to welcome Eleonora Vasquez. Eleonora is a journalist with Euractiv, and she focuses on politics in the European Parliament and covers a broad range of subjects, including migration, the rule of law, EU institutional reforms, and EU elections. And before that, she was working as a press officer within the European Parliament. So I know that we've got a really great panel, and I'm really looking forward to hearing everything that you have to say, and so that all of us as well can learn and benefit from all the knowledge and the ideas that you're going to be sharing with us. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I would just like to remind everybody that I am going to be a little bit strict on the length of answers. If you could please try to keep them short, a couple of minutes, so that we can try to get a lively conversation. So I apologize in advance, but I may have to interrupt. I hope not, but I may have to if things go on a little bit long. But on the other hand, I really would like to create a conversation. So if you would like to come in on something that somebody else has said, please just put a hand up and I will try to bring you in. But again, a request just to keep it short as a quick response, especially if you don't agree. That would be great. Very happy to hear all dissenting views and extra ideas. For participants who have joined us, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. We will have a bit of time at the end of the panel session, and that so we can take your questions. But if you could then be putting them as we go through in the chat function, that would be really amazing. And my colleagues will help me choose some of the questions so that we can bring them in at the end, as I say, for about the last 10 to 15 minutes. Unfortunately, we will be giving the questions ourselves rather than allowing you that space, just because often we have technical issues by bringing people in live. So, without further ado, I would just like to set the frame a little bit for this conversation on democracy and civic space, and whether we have maybe been taking it for granted when we look at the current setting. We look at democracy as being composed of a number of different elements. One of them is obviously the representation. So this is where you have the institutional structures like, of democracy, like parliaments. And we have 2 parliamentarians with us. You have also, of course, the rule of law. So that's the courts, the presence or the absence of corruption. A third element which is important for us within democracy is rights, respect of rights and freedoms. So here we might be thinking of civil liberties, access to justice, equality. And the fourth is participation and participatory mechanisms. And of course, here we're not just thinking of being able to vote in an election, but participatory mechanisms which allow citizens and civil society to be part of decision making. Today, we'll be focusing on a couple of these elements, civic space and media freedom, and using these 2 elements as gauges or indicators, if you like, for the state of democracy in Europe and around the world. Now, when democratic backsliding occurs, and this is going to be the focus of the beginning, at least, of our conversation, what we see is a deterioration of the respect for key rights. And some of those key rights, one in particular, is this freedom of expression. And of course, that is particularly important for civil society, civic space, and for the media. So I was just wondering if I could start off by asking whether there's anyone among our panelists that agree with our starting premise that we are seeing democratic backsliding already occurring, even in Europe and even in the EU institutions. Does everybody feel comfortable with this premise as the start of the conversation, or would somebody like to disagree with me? Udo and Soraya, you feel comfortable as well with that premise, that we're working on the basis that we are seeing already democratic backsliding? Great. Okay. Well, that's going to make things at least easy to begin with. So in what I would argue is that probably from about the 1970s to about the mid-2010s, democracy has actually improved around the world. Not of course on all the indicators everywhere, but as a general trend, democracy improved. But since then, we've seen this democratic backsliding with a big decline in democracy indicators around the COVID-19 time. And since then, there hasn't really come back the same degree of democratic respect for democracy or civic space and media freedom of expression as we saw before that time. We've also seen since the 2000s and especially since 2010s, the rise of populism across Europe and the rise of authoritarianism beyond Europe, around the world, with of course the usual risks for civic space and media freedom. And so Udo, I wanted to start, if I may, with you, to ask you whether you think we've been taking democracy for granted and that we've become a bit complacent, in fact. And if that is the case, well, what was it that we stopped doing or that we didn't do enough of? Over to you.
Thanks, Tanya, for inviting us. Welcome everybody who is following us. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you. Once you gave us this interesting introductory remarks, I was thinking about whether or not this view of the last decades, the 1970 until 2010s, is not more or less a European view, dominantly European view, perhaps also especially a Western European view, and whether or not we are talking about our kiddie past and our comfort zone. And if I was an observer from what we call the Global South, wouldn't say to us, well, welcome to reality, welcome to the reality of the huge majority of the folks on the globe. Because what we developed, especially within the European Union, was a very comfortable combination of extending our welfare state, combining that on the basis of economic growth. I will not underestimate the root realities of many of our people here and there, but in general, it was a positive story where economic development, social improvement went hand in hand with the enlargement of civic freedoms and democratic rights. What was the precondition of that? The precondition was twofold. First of all, an international situation, international global politics under the dominance of the US, more or less. In the Cold War, stabilized with two superpowers, and afterwards in the imagination of one free world under neoliberal economic rule, but under the control of a multilateral accepted set of rules that also guaranteed for free markets. And both of that is not a given anymore. Neither the dominance of the US superpower as an unquestioned rule maker in the world, nor a multilateral system that is reliable and is not put into question by a more and more multipolar world. And now, if that is the frame of a global politics shift, we have external shocks. We have external shocks like the pandemic. We have external shocks like polarization of rich and poor, inequalities rising, hunger is back on the agenda, more than ever refugees all over the globe. And now our systems of our kiddie days, of our nice comfort zone days in Europe are contested. This is my picture to start off.
Thank you very much, Udo. Absolutely. And thank you for being so brief and so concise, but also covering so much in such a short space of time. Eleonora, I'd like to bring you in here as well and ask you whether you were absolutely right, Udo. We're starting from a slightly European perspective, and we're going to be broadening out to a more global picture in a moment. Coming from this European perspective, Eleonora, what do you think has been going wrong over the recent years since the 2000s that has meant that we are having this democratic backsliding?
Well, first of all, thank you for this interesting, inviting me in this interesting debate. There are so many things I would like to highlight. Maybe, first of all, we know that there are a lot of indicators about the state of democracy, not only in Europe, but also in other part of the world where there are more dictatorship, more coup d'etat, and so on and so forth. But what I can say that in general, democracy is something has to be renewed all the time. So, and it has to be adapted. And recently, there was not this big push, from my point of view, from politics in particular, but also other side of the society to update to the democracy, which is not that something was needed now, but is always needed, because this is the physiological way of working in a democracy. And media is an important part of democracy, which has experienced a losing of funds. And of course, like the less funds globally we have on media, the less quality information you have, and you have different phenomena of fake news and disinformation, and together with that, internet came, which is a great opportunity, but at the same time we don't really know how to handle internet. And now with the artificial intelligence, it's even worse with the deep fake phenomena we saw around. So it's a very complicated scenario, but we have also the technology to react to that situation. But the problem is like the reaction to fact checking, for example, or creating new tools for democracy is lower than what the snowball is going down, with the disinformation and different democratic pillars. So I think like the best thing to do in general, from the perspective of media, is trying to continue to do our job and to underline the importance of having a quality information, which is absolutely not granted nowadays.
Very true, and unfortunately so. I do want to cover a broader spectrum than just Europe. So, Soraya, maybe I could bring you in here to take us beyond thinking about Europe, especially given your perspective, because you work obviously with, Africa quite closely. But in other countries of the world, as Udo alluded to, they have other governance traditions. And democracy is not necessarily so deeply rooted, or it can be quite fragile. And I was just wondering whether, Soraya, you think there are some general trends that we could be drawing out, or whether this is very context specific, because this also shapes how one responds and what the EU can do to support partner countries. Soraya.
Can you hear me? Oh. Yes?
Yes,
thank you. And thank you, CONCORD, for organizing this debate and inviting me to participate. I think it's a general context. I would say that there had been key moments in these past years where the democratic backsliding has become more and more clear. We started this mandate with a great challenge for the European Union. Far-right and Eurosceptic parties from all around Europe had gained an unprecedented representation at the European Parliament. The democratic backsliding has been tangible even among our member states. The European Union had no other option than to suspend funding to countries like Hungary, Poland, as a measure to stop the deterioration of rule of law and human rights violations. It has been tough for 4 years where we have witnessed how autocratic regimes like Putin's are using far-right and secessionist movements to put our democracies at stake. Recently, the European Parliament reported Russian interference in elections in half of the continent, including Spain, my country, where we have seen that there had been proven relations between secessionist groups and Russian intelligence. Putin is not only doing battle on our frontiers with the illegal and criminal occupation of Ukraine, he is also trying to weaken rule of law in Europe. We are facing a moment of great challenge for the democratic principles and human rights values that the European Union incarnates. Also in Latin America, where dictators, Ortega in Nicaragua, still suffocate civil society with arbitrary detention, persecution, and violence. And meanwhile, repression is growing day by day in Venezuela, in Cuba. And we are also witnessing with great concern how coup d'etat are happening again in Africa. Between 2020 and 2023, there have been 13 coup d'etat in Africa. Okay, I think it's a general context. Therefore, at this moment, it is crucial that the European Union strengthens its role as a leader of a strong influence on a geopolitical level for defense of human rights and rule of law, not only at European level, but also beyond its borders. But for that, I'm going to finish, coherence is key. And the double standard to denounce the violation of human rights or international law is terrible for our paper. The European institution cannot be claimed for the respect of human rights in concrete context, while Israel in Gaza is committing acts which are made to amount to genocide as recognized by ICJ, with no consequences coming from the European Union. It is not enough to condemn. We should be expecting more from the European Union.
Thank you very much, Soraya. I would tend to agree with you, and I'd like to bring in Carolyn to get Carolyn's perspective on this one. So maybe we could stay looking at this more global picture, Carolyn. And I was wondering, of course, you know, the double standards is very important. Coherence is extremely important. But I was also wondering whether one of the reasons for the backsliding, or just one of the reasons why we see continued, you know, threats to democracy, is because leaders with autocratic tendencies don't actually believe that democracies can do an awful lot to stop them flouting the rules. It is very, very difficult, let's face it. So even if, for example, the EU is trying to protect human rights defenders around the world, it's trying to support Ukraine, there are, as Soraya mentioned, plenty of double standards, and we've seen that between how the EU votes in the UN on Gaza versus how it may vote on Ukraine. Often it's too little, too late. So the EU isn't actually posing a very big threat to any of these leaders with autocratic tendencies, let's say. What could the EU do differently? What could it do better in these situations?
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks to CONCORD also for inviting me today. It's a good question. I mean, and the question has been around for a long time, right? What could the EU do better? For us, it's very clearly a better link between supporting internal democracy in the EU and the external component of democracy support, because in the end, all those countries around the world, they look at the EU and they see what's happening here as well. And they point their fingers and say, well, but, you know, rule of law doesn't seem to be doing too well in Europe. So how can you come here with your conditions, especially, of course, when, in my opinion, the democratic backsliding usually starts at least as context specific, but you know, autocratic regimes, they learn from each other and they see each other and they take notes, and ultimately, you know, they form kind of coalitions and they have partners to work with that are not the EU, and they do not have conditions such as China. So in the end, what the EU can really do better, in my opinion, is to really not double down on democracy, or to double down on democracy, to not change democracy and human rights for other considerations such as trade, such as energy supply, which I understand is difficult because we live in very geopolitically turbulent times. But the EU has to stay true to its values. I think that is key. I would actually like to very quickly come back to something that Eleonora said earlier on how we haven't done enough to really, you know, support democracy. I would actually disagree with that, because I think if you look at the attempt, at least from the European Commission, you know, the push for democracy, at least internally, was a priority for the Commission. Now that doesn't say that, you know, we fixed the problem and now we're out of the dark. But I think if you look at the European Democracy Action Plan, at the various initiatives that the Commission started, that the Parliament has carried forward, on media pluralism, on the digital sphere, I think there is a lot happening, and at least I hope that this means that policymakers have realized that we do have an issue, both at home and abroad.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. I noticed, Eleonora, you had your hand up anyway because you wanted to come in, but now you've also been mentioned specifically. So please, over to you.
Thank you. No, I just want to mention about of course, I think that the EU is the right place to develop a good democracy. I think, of course, the EU institutions have a great potential that it is not expressed yet in terms of how to develop democracy. Also, we know that most of the competence at our EU member state, and this problem of sovereignty is recurrent here in Brussels. But I just want to mention something very quick and very specific that I'm facing as a problem in my everyday work: the access to documents, the lack of transparency I am facing when I have to access documents from the Commission or from the European Parliament. It takes months. Most of the time I'm not able to access documents, and I think there is also a political pressure on not giving access to documents. We have also, nowadays, the Assange case going on and on. So I think this is from a media perspective a huge problem I'm facing, and the EU institutions should really try to understand how to be more transparent. I know that sometimes it's the problem of third parties, but it's really a huge problem for me to do my job. Thank you.
Very good. I'm glad we have some very clear calls coming out already so early on in the conversation. That's wonderful. Eleonora, can I just ask you to lower your hand so that I don't get confused? Marie, I'd like to bring you in here. And I just want to make sure that we sort of make a comfortable sort of sequence between the things. I've been noticing that we've been talking about, well, what could the EU do? We're already moving into what could the EU do? In CONCORD, one of the things we're doing is we're working hard to identify and reduce what we perceive as the neo-colonial tendencies of the EU. Now, the EU promoting democracy in its partner countries has been cited by some as coming across as the EU imposing its ways. So being neo-colonial about things. How do you think the EU can carry on promoting democracy, which we all firmly believe in, and the democratic values that it espouses with its partner countries, but without coming across as being neo-colonial?
Thank you, Tanya, for this question, and thank you for having us today. Before I respond specifically to this question, I just want to respond to a point Udo made earlier about whether the sliding down of democracy is just a European aspect or something global, by reminding everyone that the 2024 State of Civil Society report was just released by Civicus and clearly highlights a continuing global decline in democracy, exacerbated by conflicts and crises. And we now have 72% of the global population living under authoritarian regimes as of 2023, 72%. And this closing of civic space is showcased at country level, but also at multilateral level, where negotiations at the UN, for example, are more and more taking place behind closed doors. And Eleonora just mentioned the lack of access to key documents, of transparency and accountability within the EU, but that can be occurred globally. It is a complicated scenario, but we can't lose track of our responsibilities and ability to shape things up with political commitment. So I wanted to put that in the broader context, also flag that at FORUS, we are definitely noting a troubling decrease in political commitment to internationally agreed frameworks, whether it is the 2030 agenda or the Paris Agreement. Even countries who are planning to report on voluntary national reviews are now stepping back towards making those commitments and reporting, which is really worrying and has to be kept in mind. In terms of the EU, the European Union definitely has a critical role to play in promoting democracy and democratic values globally. We are already seeing that. The EU is playing a key role right now, for example, in pushing for the integration of key language for the promotion of democracy, human rights, sustainable development, whether it's at the Pact for the Future that is set to be adopted in September, or whether it is promoting the role of civil society during the latest meeting of the Special Committee and the Charter of the UN. That is, of course, greatly appreciated. However, and you've just highlighted that, the challenge lies in doing so without perpetuating power imbalances and neo-colonial practices. And One such ambition will, of course, soon be tested with the implementation of the Global Gateway project, for example, around the world. So what needs to happen? Well, definitely a paradigm shift in how we engage within the European Union with partners, ensuring partnership agreement. We need to transition from a donor-recipient mindset to genuine partnerships, which involves recognizing and respecting the sovereignty, the context and priorities of partner countries, and engaging in dialogue on equal footing. We need to have inclusive dialogue. EU institutions need to increase dialogue with a diverse range of civil society actors as well, not just within the European Union, but in partner countries as well, ensuring that policies and initiatives are informed by those with on-the-ground experience and that reflect the needs and aspirations of local populations. And for that, we need to support that local leadership. It's important to focus on supporting local actors and supporting the localization agenda that was already outlined by the OECD DAC recommendation on enabling civil society. And that includes prioritizing direct support to local NGOs and community groups. If we want them to monitor the work, to be there to see what's happening, we need that support. And of course, the European Union is already doing that by supporting some civil society actors in monitoring the situation for enabling environment, and we are very grateful for that. But this needs to be done not just on civic space, but also on European project as well, to make sure we have that balance. Do not just help in monitoring what's happening in other countries, but also help in monitoring what European Union is doing and member states are doing. A big call for transparency and accountability. Eleonora has already done that, but we really need to make sure that we do not end up with double discourse. EU actions are viewed as legitimate and aligned with the principles of democracy and mutual respect that needs to be promoted, and addressing structural inequalities with a critical examination of the EU's own policies and practices. So CONCORD has now just launched the EU for Global Justice campaign. We need to look at that very closely. We need to engage more substantially with all civil society actors throughout policy cycle. By adopting these approaches, the EU can play a constructive role in promoting democracy and democratic values while avoiding those pitfalls of neocolonialism, and instead fostering equitable and respectable partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Udo, thank you, by the way, Marie, for the call out for our hashtag, EU for Global Justice. Udo, I'd like to bring you in here, if I may, because you're a practitioner. This is something that you're trying to do all the time, is, you know, living up to the democratic values, seeing how the European Parliament can promote the democratic values with partner countries. What do you try to do here, and what do you think you could be doing more of, and how do you react to some of the suggestions that Marie was sharing?
Criticism and self-criticism is always a good start point. Seriously, I'm advocating that there is a close relationship between the social and economic model we are striving forward and the state of democracy, the state of our civic freedoms, the quality of our democratic life. Let me try to exemplify that. And that is not always in general true, that is also especially true in eras of transformation. Let me try to exemplify that with the flagship project that the recent Commission was longing for, the Green Deal. The Green Deal was so the echo of the demands of the last campaign. Progressive forces were saying, well, we have to do something for the 2030 agenda. The best case would be you make the United Nations 2030 agenda to the political program of the new incoming Commission, and the answer was the Green Deal. Today, we are in a situation where not only the ultra-right-wing populists, but also many of the conservative side argue, and I hear them saying, well, what Timmermans brought to the citizens of Europe was the biggest bullshit we could ever think of. It is an over-bureaucratic monster, and that is echoed domestically by a lot of our people. I can give proof in my own home country, in Germany, which is basically not the poorest of our member states, people are totally afraid that they cannot live up to the new challenges of ecological modernization, the new systems of heating, the new systems of transport, etc., as long as these new challenges are not accompanied by respective transfers of resources, enabling strategies, inclusive policies, etc., etc. If you look at the curve in which the right-wing populists in Germany were increasing their share in the polls, then you will not find in the first wave a reaction to migration pressures. No, you will find the heating debate as the nucleus of the upheaval of the right wing in my country. So I see the domestic element of that. If you look to the international discussion, especially in Latin America and elsewhere, they don't call it the Green Deal. They call it the new attempt of extractive capitalism, because the Europeans try to just change the game once they have realized they need a new, more sustainable version of technologies, which does not change anything in the modes of exploitation, as long as they do not go along with a radical debt reduction, with bottom-up strategies of sustainable development, enabling of communities from the bottom to the ground in the respective countries. So we are torn in between with a nice attempt to modernize, because we lost the gravity to come forward with a scheme which recombines in the area of transition the necessary ecological modernization with the necessary social distribution dimension. And here we lose democracy. Here exactly, if you look at the recent report, Human Development Report of the United Nations, you can exactly understand, very good paper, by the way, you can exactly imagine how distrust is growing according to moving global and local realities. People lose trust. People lose trust in their perspectives, individually and collectively. People lose trust in democratic institutions. And here, the populist machinery jumps in, the Trump machinery, the Orban machinery, the Bolsonaro machinery, however you would like to call it, and they have more or less always a couple of similar elements: ignore climate change, ignore major challenges, fake majority building by fake leadership, which does not solve the problems, on the basis of a new set of media politics, which does not commit ourselves to a similar commitment to truth. There is no truth anymore. In the Trump campaign, there is no truth anymore, because the supporters living in a bubble which is totally separated from what other people would regard to be the real world. So this is the complex reality. And the question, what can Europe do? We have to recombine our modernization strategies, externally as well as internally, with redistribution strategies. I'm a total fan and advocate on the 2030 agenda. It's a much better compass than the Green Deal, because the Green Deal always is tempted to fall short according to a holistic scheme that can only be successful.
Thank you very much, Udo. So you've covered a lot of ground there, Udo, which I can only sum up simply by using a phrase that many of our civil society partners are using, and this is about a just transition. Creating a just transition is extremely important, but that just transition, of course, can't just be for European citizens. It has to be for everyone around the world. Because, as you rightly say, we're often exporting our problems, and we're all often trying to find our solutions elsewhere as well, without making sure that they also have the social security that they need, the social policies that they need, and with the EU taking away with one hand what it gives with another. So, for example, as you say, not agreeing to certain international tax policies, not looking into debt, and so on and so forth. I think here this brings us to the relationship as well between equality in a society, because equality is one of those indicators of democracy that I mentioned at the beginning, and that's often used to measure the state of democracy. And it seems that there are many instances where democracy and equality are sort of moving in the same direction. So it could be a virtuous circle, but it can very easily become a vicious circle. So, for example, many countries which are perhaps now experiencing, in Europe, I would say, now experiencing really growing inequalities, but where you've had inequalities in other countries for a long, long time, of course, but populist leaders or ones with authoritarian or extremist tendencies have emerged, and they managed to feed then and feed on, so they actually feed and feed on the segments of the population who are feeling marginalized, who are suffering from this economic hardship that you've been talking about, Udo, like people who would not be able to replace their boiler or whatever it would be to be in line with the, the new policies that the government's imposing. These people feel really marginalized and they're worried. And so the risk, of course, is then the populist leaders, they are feeding on this. They then get into power because they seem to be talking about the things that matter to people. But then you have an even bigger risk of they're going to start shrinking civic space, other rights will become violated, and we end up with this vicious circle rather than a virtuous. Marie, this was for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, you rightly mentioned that, Tanya. Inequalities is growing all over the world. The Sustainable Development Goals are lagging behind and even making progress. We even sliding down towards sustainable development. And that is having huge consequences around the world with inequalities growing, whether it is in Latin America, Africa, or Asia. This year, 2024, is a huge year of elections. We know that over 60% of the population will be going to the polls, which leaves us all in fears of what could happen. As you rightly noted, there's a huge growth of far-right populist and autocratic leaders who often capitalize on the grievances of those most affected by inequality. These leaders promise swift and radical changes to the status quo, which can be appealing to those who feel left behind. But too often, we know that those leaders prioritize policies that consolidate their power instead of addressing the root causes of inequalities. I've mentioned it before. We're already noting that the conspiracy theory and disinformation campaigns taking place, which are eroding support for internationally agreed objectives, portraying them as schemes for global control or the North taking over. All this is even more dangerous. And with elections coming up, we're seeing civic freedom, civic liberties shrinking around the world, internet shutdowns taking place, jeopardizing democracy's foundational values. So here again, we can only strengthen again the key role that the EU can play, should play in this direction, strengthening democratic institutions, not just at home, but also abroad, ensuring accountability to all segments of society, especially the most marginalized one, and those who are suffering for this increasing inequality breach, advocating for benchmark and legally binding reporting mechanism for the implementation of those agreements. The Agenda 2030 is amazing, but we don't have compulsory benchmarks to report on their implementation. Ensuring as well, playing a lead role in ensuring that there is alignment between those agendas and financial investments. We know how complicated it can be to implement those agreed upon objectives if the finances are not here. The EU can be there, helping to push for that alignment. The EU can also be there to strengthen the role that the private sector, that international financial institutions and public development banks can play for sustainable development. And I will also want to ensure that we don't forget the role that the EU can play as well in promoting for enabling environment worldwide, promoting civic education and engagement to empower citizens globally for a vibrant civil society. So by tackling those root causes of inequality, we can work together like to go against that loop and vicious circle.
Thank you very much, Marie. Caroline, Udo was talking about the need to build trust. Soraya also mentioned policy coherence. I think Udo was also working in that direction. We're talking about internal, we're talking about external. So there's a lot of different factors and elements and ways we can look at this. But when we look at what the European Parliament is actually doing, and you were quite favourable earlier on. I found you very positive, and I want to be slightly challenging towards you, if I may, in terms of what the European Parliament is doing to protect civic space, to prevent transgressions of the rule of law, and so on and so forth. But if I take the example of the Defence of Democracy package, from my perspective at least, this doesn't seem all good. And it does actually at least make me wonder what the intentions are sometimes behind some of these initiatives. So what's your take on this, and what would you like to see the European Parliament do here?
Yeah, thank you a lot for bringing up the Defense of Democracy package, because that is something I wanted to get to either way, because I think it will be one of the first files that the new Parliament will have to deal with, since we didn't manage to get it anywhere in this mandate, for the better, to say, because it's just not ready to be legislation that protects anyone, really. So the Defense of Democracy package is really critical for us because it has good intentions. We talked a lot about transparency. We're talking about elections. We're talking about foreign influence. But the issue with this package really is that because of the directive on foreign funding, it's not going to do its job. It will not prevent anyone from actually influencing politics. And at the same time, it holds a lot of different risks. And that actually goes back to the point of linking internal and external, because it's not just a directive that will concern member states inside of the EU, but it will also have major implications on how the EU is positioned internationally, because the EU has been very vocal about foreign agent laws in the world. That will not be possible anymore if we have a similar law at home, at least in the current form of the text. The package itself also has a risk of inspiring authoritarian regimes to justify the restrictions at home. This goes again both for European member states, but we already see it in non-European states. And it's really problematic because the EU will not be able to stand up and say, we do really care about civic space and we do want to foster it. And another point is, of course, the stigmatization of civil society. So if the new EU, let's say after the election, so the new parliament, the new commission are really serious about, taking the cooperation with civil society to the next level, they can't go ahead with this file. And I think that is something that the parliament should really be aware of, because the file will be one that's on the desks first when they start their work after elections, and they will have to make decisions here. But the package itself carries major risk and actually will be an opportunity, if done right and if discussed right by the different groups in parliament, to really show that the EU is a true ally to civil society.
Okay, thank you very much. Soraya, I would love to bring you in here, please, if I may. How do you react to what Caroline has said? And how would you combine this with the concern that in the next parliament, there will be an even bigger shift to the right than you mentioned has happened already in this parliament? This was one of the things you said in your opening remarks. We've already had a shift to the right. It's going to be even bigger next time around. What will happen to this kind of initiative? What are the concerns and what can we do about it? Soraya, we can't hear you yet.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Okay, I think We need to advance. The European Union, the European Union needs to continue strengthen our social policy. And at this moment, we have estimation, but the real election, it will be in June. And we need, it's our responsibility to work together with our society, especially, I think, with the young people. We need big implication. It's necessary remember the 2019 European election saw the highest turnout since 1994, driven by a surge in youth participation. But however, as reported by the European Youth Forum, just a few months before the next European elections, only 6 members of the European Parliament are still under 30 years old. This is not even 1% of all MEPs, a lot less than the global average. For me, it's an incredible figure, but it is very clear for the European Union to meet the challenges for young people today. We need more young candidates and youth representation. In the current cost of living, young people are anxious to enter the labor market, find a paying job. And it is very important, the reality of the young people in European Union is very hard. 1 in 4 young people in Europe are at risk of living in poverty and or social exclusion. And youth is a recurrent topic in electoral campaigns, but reality is that we talk very little about the real problems that young people are facing and will continue to face in the next mandate.
Soraya,
For the reason, yes.
I've seen a question in the chat that I'd like to link with what you're saying now, if I may. So somebody is asking us, we don't have a name, unfortunately, but somebody is asking us, should you be re-elected? And I want to put this to Udo as well. Should you be re-elected, do you have any plans in your political agenda towards the active involvement of civil society in policy making? I think we could stretch this to the broader picture of civil society, which is also young people, because you're talking about young people and the importance of involving young people. So what would be your plans to make sure that we get people and young people and civil society much more engaged and involved in policy making?
Who's next?
I'm going to put it to Soraya first, if I may, Udo, because she was on the young people front, and I thought, oh, I'm going to jump on the bandwagon,
okay.
and then I'm going to bring you in, Udo. But 1 minute, please, Soraya.
No, Udo. Okay.
So your concrete plans, please.
No, okay. First, we need more young people in governments and institutions. It is very important. But European democracy is about much more than just voting. And the large-scale protests, engagement in the digital sphere, is another form of activism. And honestly, in my opinion, the young people is very active in this activism. And the most important things at the current moments climate change, human rights, the youth, the young people is very active, but it is necessary to open the institutions, the public institutions, to open more transparency in the for the institutions. I think it's our role in the institutions.
We're going to look forward to you lobbying the European Commission to have many more younger people in future on their books. Udo, over to you, please. What do you think you could be doing in the future if you were to be re-elected to make sure that you're supporting
what we
civil
did already
society?
in Germany is to reduce the election age for this European election from 18 to 16. So for the first time, young men and women with 16 years age are participating in this European election, which is a huge step forward. What we love doing and what we continue doing is to have dialogues with schools, with young people in education systems, in universities, as well as those who start their working life very early. My plea for many, many years already is that the Council should allow us for more budget positions in school exchanges, in the exchanges of young working people, because it's one of our best chances to let a European mindset grow if you have the chance, and that everybody should have, which is not dependent, should not be dependent on the stage of your parents' incomes, that you exchange, you go to Spain, you go to Portugal, to Finland, to have an experience of a couple of months with your working life, with your education, which really gives you a gift for the rest of your life. Then we have positive responses. The more close, the more direct we go on the issues of everyday life of young people. They want to get involved. And the experience at the end of the day is it is not only be done and cannot be done by parliamentarians only. We see the quality of democracy being dependent on the quality of journalism as well as on the quality of politics. So it's both sides that have to contribute. And finally, healthy communities, inclusive communities on the ground in our local authorities, in our counties, in our regions are the best guarantee to have a pro-European, pro-democratic atmosphere in our civic societies and positive involvement of the young. My experience with young people is they sometimes tell me if they have a choice between, they would like to vote for young people, that's for sure. But if they have a choice between Giorgia Meloni, 47, and Bernie Sanders, 82, they go for the older one. Because sometimes mindset is not the age of your mindset is not always a question of your natural age. It's the way in which you perceive and communicate the challenges of our days.
Thank you, Udo. Yeah, indeed. There's another interesting question in the chat, and I'd like to bring you in here, Eleonora, and it links to a few things that different people have been saying. And it's talking about young people, but also the use of digital media. And you were saying that, you know, Soraya, that people are often very active also digitally, you know, in the digital space. You were commenting, Eleonora, on sometimes the, you know, the difficulties that one can find in this digital space. And we have a question in the chat, which is talking about the rise of digital surveillance, online censorship, but also about actually needing to safeguard digital rights. What do you think should be done here, Eleonora? And do you agree that you know, much more safeguarding is needed?
Thank you so much for the question. I will be very quick. So I think the main problem is that fighting disinformation is a slow process because, for example, now I'm working on a project called Electifact to fact check fake news and disinformation on a EU election. And to debunk one sentence said by an MEP, it takes me half a day. So it means that the news can be launched in half a second, and I have to take half a day to fact check it because I need to, you know, debunk, to do my research and everything. So this is actually the same problem with the use of artificial intelligence. So now the European Union is the first continent trying to regulate artificial intelligence and also the digital space. It's not easy because there is we are in time of crisis of democracy, and you have to find a balance between public security and democratic rights. And we are struggling nowadays to do that because for example, again, when coming back to the access to documents, most of the arguments the institution give me is like to protect public security or to protect the integrity of the institution or whatever, when I think that most of the time they should be, you know, public interest information. There is a high public interest and should be out. So at the end of the day, we are always in the, you know, class of political science at university thinking about what's the division line between transparency and public security. And I think we are really, really struggling in Europe nowadays about that. And I mean, not in, you know, what is announced, but then in the daily life of democracy, which I think is completely different from a press release or what is said. And this is what actually we try to tell as a journalist. And I completely agree with Udo when he said that also media has a great responsibility in delivering and to shape the public debate. It's a relation, you know, complementary with the politician, and we have also to rethink the way it's hard to rethink the way we give news. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Udo, for joining us. I just want to jump in to say thank you. We are going to now wrap up, but I'll say immediate goodbye to you, Udo, and thank you very, very much, because I know you have to go. Please don't hesitate to leave now, Udo. Thanks a lot. So I do want to thank all of you for joining us. I'm conscious we've now hit the 1 hour. It's a very short space of time, but you've managed to share a lot of ideas in that time. So thank you all very, very much. And at least within Concord, I can guarantee that we're going to be absorbing these ideas and seeing how we can fit them into our campaign, EU for Global Justice, and also into the upcoming 2 discussions that we'll be having with further panelists. The next one will be on the EU budget. And a couple of you have been mentioning the EU budget and the importance of funding for civic space and other social causes, etc., for the environment. So we will be looking at the EU budget and funding for sustainable development, as well as how to ensure consistency in the EU's policies and actions. And that is also, this policy coherence has come out today. Clearly, it's going to be very, very important. This will be held on Tuesday, the 16th of April at 11 o'clock in the morning, CET. So that's sort of European time, or part of Europe time anyway. And we very much hope that you'll be able to join us for that. So thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you to the participants as well for having joined us, and thank you for your questions in the chat. And we very much look forward to the next conversation together. Thank you all, and have a lovely afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Been a really interesting conversation. Look forward to following it up together as well and keeping in touch. Take care and have a lovely afternoon.
You too.
Thank
Bye.
you, Tanya.